Hello, I am Dr. Weiss, and this PowerPoint presentation is on the ancient world culture and the rise of civilization. This is an introductory lecture to my world literature class, to the several world literature classes that I teach of the ancient world. And today I'm going to talk about, first of all, I'm going to talk about huge amounts of time, the huge amounts of the passage of time. And I sort of want to contextualize these long periods of time with our own life. I mean, when we think about our own lives, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, 30 years that pass, they seem like to us a very long period of time. The sort of time periods that we're talking about are bracketed by thousands of years in some cases. And so we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about the culture and civilization and the beginnings of civilization in the ancient world. First of all, where did people come from? There are two prevailing models of people coming into the rest of the world. The most prevalent model, probably the most popular model, is the out of Africa model, where pre-hominids on the continent of Africa develop into Homo sapiens and move out into Europe, into Eurasia, into the Far East, and eventually into Australia and into the Americas. Now, even in looking at the dates of peopling of the world on this map, this is already a little bit outdated. It seems that every time you look at a map and time frames of when people moved into different parts of the area, new research has shown, for instance, in the Americas, this map shows about 12,000 years ago. That number now is actually closer to 20,000, and some scholarship suggests maybe even 30,000. So as new research and new scholarship develops, these dates also change. So the out of Africa model is the most popular model of people moving into the rest of the world. The other not as popular model is the multi-regionalism model, which suggests that perhaps modern people developed simultaneously in different parts of the world. The evidence for that is not nearly as convincing as the out of Africa model. So we're going to be looking at a series of maps to contextualize the geography, to think about where we are in the world and where we are talking about as the cradles of the first civilizations. We are looking here at Mesopotamia, which means land between two rivers. We are looking at the cities here on this map of the region of Sumer, of Kish and Uruk and Ur and Lagash, Umma and Nippur. And in the literature, we'll be talking a little bit later on, or at least mentioning some of the first literatures that come out of this part of the world, Gilgamesh in particular. This is where we're talking. We see also on this map Egypt, which is going to come into the picture a little bit later in terms of civilization than the Sumerian or Mesopotamian region. The Egyptian Empire from roughly 3000 to 300 BCE. Again, it comes into the picture a little bit later than the Sumerian or the Levantine region, the coastal regions of Syria, Lebanon, and Palestine. Egypt gets domesticated animals from the Sumerian and Levantine region, and they also get wheat and barley. And we're going to talk a little bit later about trade. The Aegean region to 300 BCE. We'll be talking about this in my world literature course when we talk about the Iliad and the Odyssey. We can see in this part of the world, in Greece, the Aegean Sea, the coastline. And today we're going to talk also about landscape and how landscape informs and shapes culture and technology. Assyria to 850 BCE. There'll be names like the Assyrians and the Elamites and the Hittites, Sumeria as a regional designation. The Babylonians. This is a period of time that is always in flux. It's a period of time of empires that rise, that climax, that descend, that are overtaken by other cultures. And oftentimes when one empire replaces another empire in this part of the world, people are both assimilated and in some cases dispersed. Certain aspects of culture are adopted, Language is transformed, technology is adopted and utilized and disseminated throughout the various regions. Importantly, natural resources are often obtained through colonial pursuits, through empiric pursuits to take over your neighbor. If you need construction materials, you can either do one of two things. You can trade for them. If they don't, if a natural resource does not occur in your area, you can trade for them, or you can take them from your neighbor. The Greek Empire, roughly 800 BCE to 200 BCE. What you'll also notice in this presentation, these periods of time sometimes overlap, or they don't exactly touch one another. So I might have a period of time that says 800 to 200, and in another slide, 100. Well, doesn't the next period start off at 200 BCE as well? These are periods of time that are designated by scholars at a much later period of time in history. So these are not well-defined periods of time. They evolve slowly over long periods of time, and oftentimes when we talk about the movement of one empire to another, these are by small steps. So we do not see a hard designation from one period of time to another. It's not like you were taking a book and closing it or opening up a new chapter. These evolve over periods of time. Sometimes there are monumental moments in history that can facilitate a new moment in time, the toppling of an empire, an assassination of a pharaoh. But in general, these moments in time, these periods in time, slowly evolve from one dynasty, one pharaoh, one empire to another. The Roman Empire, roughly 100 BCE to 476 CE, and we're going to talk about a little bit later what those designations are as well. You can see from this map the Roman Empire was one of the largest from the other maps and empires that we just looked at. So geographic-wise, space-wise, the Roman Empire in the early part of the first millennium was really quite impressive. And the Roman Empire, like most empires, is able to be successful because of the things it borrowed and appropriated and maybe improved upon from the Greeks. And the Greeks were successful because of the things that they were able to advance and make better, so on and so forth, from the Assyrians or the Babylonians, and earlier from people in the Sumerian region. At the same time, when we talk about ancient civilizations and we talk about Sumeria, the cradle of civilization, the Fertile Crescent, I also want us to contextualize or keep in mind that there are other civilizations that are taking place in different parts of the world. You know, we're going to be talking about Ur and Uruk and the sorts of things, the development of language, but there are also sometimes independent developments in different parts of the world. Here is a map of the Shang dynasty from roughly 1300 BCE to 1000 BCE. The Shang dynasty is replaced eventually by the Zhou dynasty in the first millennium BCE. And the Zhou dynasty exists alongside in the historical period of the developing Greek Empire. The Zhou dynasty is known for being interested in education and technology. So you have leaps being made in technology through both trade and interaction with other cultures, while at the same time you have independent development within these cultures of technology and culture that they're developing on their own. In the Mohenjo-Daro or Harappan civilizations, which existed roughly from 3300 BCE to 1300 BCE. And one of the things that you'll notice here is that these early civilizations developed along waterways. In this case, this is the Indus Valley civilizations. Scholars don't know a lot about the Mohenjo-Daro or Harappan civilization. They seem to have disappeared, and there wasn't anybody living there for about 700 years or so. There are various hypotheses as to why the civilization disappeared. I mean, they obviously existed for a long period of time. One possibility is a series of floods, and this is a topic of interest for the people in ancient Sumeria. And also, these civilizations, scholars don't understand the language. Unlike Sumerian, the Sumerians left extensive syllabaries, or essentially dictionaries, on how to read their language. The Harappan civilization and the Mohenjo-Daro civilization, scholars do not understand the language, and so we don't know a lot about these people. So there was about a 600 or 700 year absence of people in this region, or large civilization, absence of large civilization, and the Indo-Aryans came from the northwest into this region around 200 BCE. They set up their civilization, they moved from the Indus River Valley system over to the Ganges River system. So culture began to develop there during the end of the first millennium. So here's a map, just a kind of general, a map here to show us the various civilizations existing around the world at roughly the same time. We have China around 4000 BCE, the Indus Valley, here's a middle number more or less at 2500 BCE, Egypt 3100 BCE, the Hittites, and so this is in Sumeria, north of the Sumerian Peninsula, 1300 BCE, Greece beginning in 4000. So it's important, I think, for us to understand that it's not just people in ancient Sumeria, although these are some of the oldest civilizations, but at the same time there are civilizations that are developing sometimes independently of one another all across the world. I also want to mention here that in Mesoamerica, here it puts Mesoamerica at 5000 BCE. Oftentimes the development of civilization in Mesoamerica is a separate conversation with the Fertile Crescent, and certainly the advancement, or the sort of advanced stage of civilization in Mesoamerica lags behind in some ways some of the other civilizations in the rest of the world. But in Mesoamerica in 5000 BCE, there are people developing from Neolithic villages, or I should say into villages, from nomadic hunter-gatherer. 5000 BCE, the Olmec, the people in Mesoamerica, which are going to develop in the 2nd millennium BCE, the Olmec civilization in the lowlands of central Mexico. These people are the precursors to the Mayans. They are domesticating a plant called teosinte, which is maize. And maize started with a kind of grass-looking plant that had only a dozen or so kernels into a plant that sustained people all throughout the Americas. Okay, time. Some of the terms that I might use might be synonymous, and I think it's important for us to know that BCE means before Common Era, and these numbers count down essentially to 0, and then the numbers increase. So the Common Era starts at 0, and we are living in 2020, and what a year that it has been of the Common Era. You might also be familiar with BC, before Christ, or AD, Anno Domini, the year of our Lord. Really in the scholarship, we don't typically use BC and AD because these are religious terms, so we would use BCE or CE, before Common Era or Common Era. And then BP, which means before present, and we would use this term in thinking about long periods of time. So if we're thinking about 30,000 years ago, we might say 30,000 years before present. Whether it's 28,000 or 32,000 may not make a big difference. One of the reasons why these dates are always changing, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, is because there's more things that are discovered. There are lots of things out there. Coming from the Middle East, there are discoveries that are made all the time which add to, inform, provide more details, or in some cases change completely our understanding of a particular culture or a particular people in a particular region. What also changes our understanding of ancient peoples is that the dating techniques have changed. Whether we're talking about genetic markers and understanding where people in Mesoamerica came from the Eurasian, from Eurasia, or we're talking about plants. In terms of plants, historically, scholars have made morphological designations and comparing morphological characteristics as opposed to now where they're doing more genetic, thinking about plants in terms of genetics and similarities and differences. So 7,000 to 1500 BCE, weaving and metallurgy were some of the early art forms that were practiced. I mean, that's a huge amount of time. Before 3500 BCE, and this date is going to be different depending on the region and depending where we might be in the world, there are different sorts of things going on at different times. So would all cultures at 7000 BCE be weaving and involved in metallurgy? No. So this is just a kind of broad understanding of a handful of, really a handful of thousands of years where this might be practiced in different parts of the world. The Copper Age, from 5000 to 2500 BCE. Copper is a soft metal. Weapons couldn't really be made out of them, but coins and various kinds of pecuniary exchange items could be made out of them. Vessels could be made, and this is going to be important. Now, this is probably going to be supplanted by advancements in ceramics. Because having vessels to contain dried meat and fruit is going to be important because this allows you to sustain populations in a village. The Bronze Age, again, dates vary from region to region, roughly 3500 to 1200 BCE. Bronze is a combination of tin and copper. Sculptures were made out of bronze. Pecuniary items were made out of bronze. Vessels were made out of bronze, and weapons could be made out of bronze. Bronze is much harder a material than copper. And eventually we'll get into the Iron Age, 1200 BC to 300 AD. And this is certainly something that the Europeans are going to have an advantage over people in the Western world when they eventually get here in the late 15th century. So 7000 to 2000 BCE, the development of farming communities. Sumerians developed agriculture in wheat and barley. Egyptians, grains, figs, and fruit. And in Greece, wheat, barley, olives, figs, and almonds. So beginning about 3500 to 3000 BCE, we have the beginning of cities. And this is really a major moment in human history, that people move from basic hunting and gathering, maybe a little bit of agriculture, to having fields that are, first of all, you have to have the technology to drain fields and marshes of water, to divert water from larger bodies to irrigate your fields. There was a lot of trial and error. What was the consequence of this? Well, you had we're going to have a division of labor, people that specialize in different things. Most importantly, with the advent of large-scale agriculture, you could have more people living together in cities. So sites along the Tigris and Euphrates River of Mesopotamia, which is now Iraq, and the Nile River in Egypt, is where some of the first cities were founded. There's also this date of about 3500 BCE is also important because it took about this period of time, for instance, the Nile River settles upon its course that it essentially has today. We talked about perhaps one of the reasons why the Harappan civilization disappeared. It could have been flooded out, resources could have been used up. But floods were a concern in the ancient world. Flooding is a concern in Gilgamesh, that there was a flood in the ancient past. One of the important stories in the Judeo-Christian tradition is about the flood. And these are not, this is a story that does not originate in the Hebrew Bible, but importantly, the story of the flood predates the Hebrew Bible by thousands of years. Flooding was a concern of civilization. The Nile at about 3500 B.C.E., having its essentially settling in its modern track, becomes a very predictable river. The inhabitants that live near the Nile in Egypt know when the Nile is going to flood, when it's going to recede, and in fact the silt that is left behind from flooding from the Nile is probably some of the most fertile in the entire world. In fact, it's so fertile that scholars believe that there could have been up to 3 harvests per year in the floodplains surrounding different parts of the Nile. The Tigris and the Euphrates rivers were very, very different, and flooding and catastrophic flooding was often a consequence. And I might have some pictures of this that I'll get back to. Okay, so the 4 important aspects that scholars have identified pertaining to the rise of civilization is large-scale agriculture, the cities and larger populations which agriculture can support, trade, not just local trade, but also regional trade. And scholarship now has shown that it is not just the various Sumerian cities within the Sumerian region, Nippur and Lagash and Ur and Uruk, that traded with one another, but in fact trade went much, much further than that. In fact, in the Indus Valley civilization, one of the items that was produced there was cotton. And this was one of the first civilizations that produced cotton into a usable textile, and evidence showed that this Indus Valley civilization traded their cotton, and it was found, and it has been found, in the Sumerian region as well. So this was important because goods, whether it's building materials or food, you have trade, you have interaction with neighbors, not just locally, but much further in a regional geographic space. And importantly, you have writing. And we're going to talk a little bit today about writing as a technology and how it was transformative. But as civilizations become more complex, you have to have a way to keep track of things, keep track of how much of something is being traded with somebody else, and how much is it worth, and how much is being paid for. So writing was in part developed as a tool for administrative functions and for some other things that we will look at here shortly. So with cities, with the rise of civilization, we have farming, advancements in astrology, agricultural techniques, and irrigation, which allowed populations to grow, sort of as a summary of what I've been talking about. Change from nomadic hunter-gatherer societies to larger communities, learn how to organize manage large-scale labor force for agricultural production, facilitated greater improvements in science and other areas, including gardening, city planning, philosophy, and literature. Okay, so sort of here in summary. But you have a division of labor in cities. It's not everybody does the hunting, everybody sets up shelter, let's take it all down, let's move somewhere else. Now you have people that begin to specialize in, let's say, engineering, and building aqueducts, and building irrigation canals. That is what you are good at. What am I good at? I might be good at hunting. So I'm going to be part of a group of people that are going to provide meat. What might you be good at? Well, I might be good at something that has to do in the domestic realm, or building houses. What might I be good at? I might be good at philosophy. So you can farm, and you can build, and you can do this, and you can do that. I'm going to philosophize. I'm going to think about gardening and gardening styles. I'm going to think about literature. And so with the rise of cities, you have the more people that need to be managed. You have division of labor, and this allows some of the things that we might think of that construct society, like literature and philosophy and even gardening, to grow and exist. What do cities provide? Cities provide safety, community, and identity. And so I've been talking about Sumeria as a region, and the cities in Sumeria, like as I've mentioned, Nippur and Lagash and Ur and Uruk, but these are not part of a country or these are not part, these people don't identify that they are Sumerian, rather that they identify with their own city. So each of these cities would be dominated by a leader, a priest, a temple, a god that city, a god that is the patron of that city. These cities would have their own militias, their own armies, and oftentimes these cities within these regions fight one another, not just people from different cultural traditions. So the rivers of life, the Tigris and Euphrates, and we can see here behind me both of these rivers on the map. I talked earlier about around 3,500 to 4,000 BCE, the Nile settles in essentially to its modern track, as do the Tigris and Euphrates. Both of these rivers, however, remain very difficult to navigate. The Tigris is very, very swift, and you essentially cannot travel or communicate or move upriver with the Tigris essentially until steam engine power is invented. The Euphrates has many tributaries. Oftentimes, in short periods of time, the track of the Euphrates changes and tributaries are blocked off and other tributaries are open, so it remains difficult to navigate. But this is where civilization begins along these rivers. So just some images here of landscape and the Tigris and Euphrates rivers here. And one of the things that I think you'll notice here immediately is that the areas surrounding these rivers are fairly dry looking. Maybe in the immediate vicinity we have some greenery. Oftentimes the floodplains around these rivers are very fertile, but with the Tigris and Euphrates, civilization had a difficult time because they flooded, and if you had agricultural fields, if you had housing and shelter near these rivers and they flooded, this could be catastrophic. How can we relate to that? Well, all you have to do is turn on the news. So while water is life-giving and life-sustaining, it is also an incredibly destructive force. Along the Mississippi River, oftentimes they have these huge dikes that are built. Oftentimes, and I've seen some of them in Louisiana, some of these dikes are 20 feet tall, and at times the Mississippi River will go beyond these dikes and flood the surrounding countryside and houses and so on and so forth. Some other images here of the Tigris and Euphrates as it winds through Mesopotamia. Ziggurats, one of the main architectural developments of cities in Sumeria, also used by the Babylonians, the Elamites, the Akkadians, and Assyrians. These were used for local religions. These structures stood in front of a temple as a kind of sanctuary to the gods. They were also used as a storehouse or a granary, and for other valuable goods. The ziggurat is alluded to in a popular story in the Hebrew Bible, in the Tower of Babel. And so these elevated structures would elevate the priest class, and they can address the masses. And it also physically elevated people up to the sky and to the various divinities that existed, the various sky gods that existed in the different theological traditions. Here is an example of an aqueduct in Caesarea, Israel, an example of the Sumerian star map. One of the things that I find really quite interesting is that, when we think about cultures that are 200 years old, or, we think about the 19th century, the 18th century, we think about people that existed without the internet or phones or cars or all sorts of different things. And we think to ourselves, wow, those people, how could they have lived? I mean, it wasn't until the 19th century that toilet paper was invented, modern toilet paper, or toothpaste or deodorant and all of those sorts of things. How did people live without those things? People lived without those things for thousands of years. And so we think about people in the ancient world and that they were without these sort of technologies. But what I would suggest to you is that people in the ancient world had all sorts of technology and the kinds of innovation that they made to alter the landscape in order for them to gather larger populations in cities and whatnot, I really think is quite interesting to figure out aspects of mathematics and astronomy and basic surgery in some cases. I really think is quite fascinating. Okay, we are going to end there for part 1. Part 2 will be forthcoming here shortly. Thank you.